Now, you and I have talked a lot before about how markets do tend to shrug off a lot of geopolitical tensions, right? Even an escalation or re-escalation, a hit like this. What do you think? Does anything change in the calculus of this war that would change sort of how markets view it?
Well, I mean, it would change if this brought the Russians to the table to bring the war to an end. And so far, of course, Putin's perspective has been the longer this war goes on, I'm Goliath and, to David in Ukraine, and I'm going to beat them. I can outlast them. I have more troops. I can destroy their morale. I'm in a dictatorship. I don't have, sort of the need to speak honestly with my own citizens, all of those things. But if it looks like Ukraine's own military capabilities with their own drones, these didn't come from NATO, these were made in Ukraine at a cost of $300 to $400 each, can take out bombers that cost $100 million. I mean, that's a 100,000 to 1 return for little Ukraine. Well, if that's the kind of thing that over time threatens Putin, threatens his country's geopolitical position, then there's a greater likelihood that the war's over. And if the war's over, then we can talk about sanctions being taken off. If sanctions are taken off, the markets, of course, are going to respond significantly to that. Now, we're not there, but it is clear that, it's very interesting. These attacks happened right before, the day before, the Russians and the Ukrainians were meant to meet in Istanbul. Ukraine knew that. They wanted to show that they actually do have some cards to play. And the Russians still showed up. They still negotiated. They talked about prisoner exchanges, which isn't new, but is important in the context of these attacks, and also even put a new offer on the table for what might bring a ceasefire, where the Russians did show movement. There's still no common ground between the two countries, but Russia today is actually in a closer space to Ukraine diplomatically, incrementally, than they were before the Ukrainians attacked Russia. So all of that is certainly information that market participants are interested in hearing. It's relevant information for them.
So Russia, Ukraine, Ian, front and center, but also in today's trade, for sure, investors were focused on the back and forth here between Washington and Beijing, trading these barbs, trading these allegations. Ian, you saw it. Who's responsible for violating this temporary trade agreement? We also had a report that Trump and Xi likely to speak this week. I'm curious how you see this playing out, Ian, and who do you think ultimately has the leverage here? Is it the U.S. or China?
Well, the latter is, of course, the most important question. At least in the first couple months since Liberation Day, the Chinese have shown that they have more leverage. They will take more economic pain than the U.S., so they are in a worse economic position. But politically, they are run by a leader without term limits, by a monopoly party that controls power, the Communist Party of China. It's been there for decades and decades. So, and Trump has checks and balances, even though he's trying to weaken them somewhat successfully. He's 78 and he's only there for one more term. So, you put that together, and China's been, their perspective is, we don't need to pick up the phone. We don't need to back down. We know that the Americans are trying to contain us. And so, this is not a place that we're prepared to capitulate. And the taco trade, as it's being called, it doesn't apply accurately to countries around the world. Most countries are not China. Most countries are weaker than the U.S. substantially, and they capitulate. But China is a different story. China is not capitulating. China is saying, we are prepared to stick unless you guys behave. And that includes on critical minerals, which a U.S. and its companies desperately need if they want to have effective industrial policy. So I do think this call between Trump and Xi, which is way overdue, is going to be incredibly important, much more important than Trump's call with Putin that lasted a couple of hours, much more important for the global marketplace, frankly, than any call or meeting that Trump has had since he became president back in January.
Do you think it's actually going to happen, Ian?
The fact that it's been announced implies that it's going to happen. I think that, I mean, Xi Jinping, this is already planned and well approved. If it doesn't happen, it'll be because Trump pulls out, not because the Chinese do. And I'd be surprised. Trump personally, when he speaks about Xi Jinping, not about what the Chinese government is doing, not about Chinese intelligence, cyber attacks, visas, students, you name it, but Xi Jinping, Trump has always shown a level of respect and even deference. He would never treat Xi Jinping the way he treats, say, Justin Trudeau, right? Never. He would never do that. And in that regard, I mean, he said that I think he's a strong leader, he's a smart leader, he governs his country effectively, all of these things. I expect that the call will indeed go ahead.
You mentioned the taco trade there, Ian. So referring to this acronym that I think the FT came up with, Trump always chickens out. Now they came up with that, Ian, kind of referring to the Trump tariff. I am interested in how you think that might apply to the world you know so well, the world of geostrategic relations, and whether you think a lot of our foreign adversaries at this point kind of might think of Trump that way too, that he huffs and he puffs, but at the end of the day, he's not likely to pull the trigger. He's not likely to try and blow your house down.
Yeah, I think it applies equally badly to geopolitics as it does to trades around the world. I love the fact that it was come up, the taco trade was an FT writer. It helps explain why Mexican food is so bad in the UK. I think that on the geopolitical front, Trump has shown that he doesn't have the cards to really push Putin around. But other leaders around the world, I mean, Panama Canal is all about geopolitics. Trump has said he'll destroy these guys if they're not prepared to actually, make way and give in to the Panamanian, to the American military. And despite the fact that it's really going to hurt the Panamanian president at home, he folds. And I think that the U.S. has had a lot more success. For example, with the Iranians and with their proxies, like the Houthis in Yemen, than he has with Russia. So like so much in the world, it's not about whether Trump is an apex predator or whether he's a coward. It's about whether or not there's a major asymmetry in power in who Trump is dealing with, and do they have the willingness to hit back? And many countries and many companies and many CEOs around the world are weenies when it comes to Trump, and understandably so. So I think it really depends. I know that doesn't make for a great acronym. It depends. I know it doesn't make for like a great soundbite. It depends. But the reality is, like so much else around Trump and very aged people in the world, it depends.
Ian, something that you talked about in one of your recent notes was the dramatic remaking of not just global trade, but sort of the U.S. economic place in the world that Trump is trying to embark upon. And just sort of, I was struck by how you put it in historical context and said this is really quite unusual what Trump is doing. What makes it so unusual? And given, as you said, this is his last term, does he have a chance of success, whatever success means, at doing that?
Well, what's unusual is that the U.S. is undoing its own role in the world. The United States, after this present world order was built by the Americans after World War II, which we almost lost because we came in so late, and it was forestalled by Charles Lindbergh and the America First movement that at the time said, don't fight the Nazis, that's in Europe, it's not our war. Well, Pearl Harbor happened, we decided that was our war, the Europeans were our allies, and the Brits and the French, and we wanted to support them, and ultimately we won, and then we chose leadership, and that's why we built all of these institutions, that's why we did the Marshall Plan, that's why MacArthur went and rebuilt Japan. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed back in 1991, we were no longer leaders. That leadership was something we inherited. We were winners. And Trump, as a president, really reflects that shift. He's not a leader. He's not interested in leading other countries around the world. He's not interested in being in charge of collective security or free trade or promoting democracy or rule of law. Trump is a winner. He's worth billions. He wants everything about himself, and he wants other countries and all of his advisors and all the corporates out there to tell him how great he is and do whatever he wants. And the strong can do what they will, and the weak will suffer what they must. And so what's happening is not what the geopolitical analysts assumed over the last decades, that the US was in decline and China was rising and we would fight because we'd be in a Thucydides trap. No, actually, the US is not in decline. The US is economically, militarily, technologically still quite strong. Its allies are much weaker. They're much more vulnerable. They're much more dependent on the US. So the relationship between the US and its allies has become more asymmetrical. China has become more powerful, and the US has unilaterally decided, for lots of structural reasons that have been coming for a good long time, that the US no longer wants to be constrained by the leadership that our forefathers put in place. And as a consequence, we are going to undo that domestic order and that global order. And Trump, in that regard, is quite a revolutionary figure. And the question is, as you say, how successful he will be in making those changes. I suspect his success will be limited because Trump is not a dictator. He is 78 years old. There is an independent judiciary in the United States. It is a federal structure with blue and red states that act in many ways autonomously from the federal government. And those things resist a revolution from above.
Right. And I'll let people Google what a Thucydides trap is, which I will be doing also. I know you referred to it in your most recent note.
Rising power, declining power leads them to fight. That's what it is. Happens
Okay.
historically, usually leads to war. Hopefully this time not so much.
Fingers crossed. Thank you, Ian. Appreciate your perspective as always.
Be good.